In parts 1 and 2 of the C6 cam selection video, we talked about the following items. First and foremost, what type of vehicle is the LS engine stuffed into? This is important because aftermarket manufacturers make camshafts for every type of vehicle that Chevrolet stuffed an LS engine in, from heavy 3/4 ton Silverado pickups to lightweight, nimble C6 Corvettes that will never be asked to tow anything. Next, we touched on the most important step in camshaft selection, and that is an honest evaluation of how you will be driving your C6 Corvette. More specifically, how much time will you be spending in the low RPMs, the mid-range RPMs, and the upper RPMs. And based on this answer, that'll dictate the type of camshaft that you select. Then we touched on cam design fundamentals, including intake and exhaust valve lift, intake and exhaust valve duration, lobe separation angle, and overlap. However, I did forget to touch on one item, and that is, what is that little plus number that you typically see on manufacturer's cam specs that follows the lobe separation angle number? As an example, take a look at this Summit camshaft description. As you can see, this camshaft has a lobe separation angle of 112 degrees, and it also has 4 degrees of advance listed. This is that little plus number that you often see. This means instead of the camshaft having a 112 degree intake lobe center line, it already has advance built into it, so the intake valve center line is 108 degrees after top dead center. And that also means the exhaust valve center line is pushed as well. So instead of it being 112 degrees before top dead center, it is now 116 degrees before top dead center. And if you add those two center lines together and divide by 2, you get your 112 degree lobe separation angle. So what's the benefit, and why do camshaft manufacturers make the camshafts with advance built into them? There's 2 main reasons. Number 1 is drivability. Number 2 is acceleration off the line. And of course, there is a slight price to pay in the upper RPM ranges. Also in part 2, we looked at a couple of camshaft dyno sheets on Richard Holdner's YouTube channel. The first one was of a very mild cam, and even though it gained horsepower everywhere along the curve, I wanted more. Then we looked at a dyno sheet of a much more aggressive camshaft, and it absolutely made great power up in the upper RPM ranges, but it gave away more low-end torque than I'm willing to trade. So if you missed those videos, they're right up here. They're packed with information, especially for the first-time cam buyer, and I highly suggest you watch them to get the most out of this camshaft selection series. So the next Richard Holdner camshaft dyno sheet that I want to take a look at is nearly perfect for my intended uses, which I mentioned back in part 1, is to mainly be for spirited street use, the occasional trip to the drag strip and autocross track, and the occasional rare instance where I may find myself stuck in stop-and-go traffic.
Rich, go for it.
So in this graph, Richard has run a 6-liter engine with 3 different camshafts. In blue is the stock Chevy truck cam, and as you can see, it has decent torque down low, but it doesn't make much horsepower up top. Then in red is the stock LS3 cam, which is very close in specs to the LS2 camshaft, and it makes a lot more horsepower, but it does lose a fair amount of torque in the low end. Finally, in green is the sloppy stage 2 cam, which makes the most horsepower and torque of all 3 cams from 3,000 RPMs on up. I wish he had run it down to 2,500 RPMs, but I did find another dyno sheet Richard did, and you can see in this one that the sloppy stage 2 cam didn't lose a whole lot of torque down low. Now this graph was run with a 5.3 engine, and so with the additional displacement of the 6-liter LS2 engine, the torque would be at least 50 pound-feet more in the 2,500 to 3,000 RPM range. So I think the sloppy stage 2 cam specs are about right for my intended use, but I didn't go with that cam. Instead, I went with the Summit Racing 8707 R1 because it was on my radar anyway, and when I was about to make the purchase, it was on the Cyber Monday sale, and the specs of this cam are right in the ballpark of what I'm looking for. So I'll put the specs below of the Summit cam that I've got in my sweaty little palms just waiting to be installed, and right below that are the specs of the sloppy stage 2 cam, so let's compare. As you can see, the Summit cam's intake duration is just a tiny bit less than the sloppy stage 2, and that should generally act to increase the low-end torque, by a little bit. The Summit Cam has 8 more degrees of exhaust duration, which I think will help compensate for the stock exhaust manifolds that I intend to use, at least initially, so that we can isolate and determine how much horsepower the cam is worth by itself. Now, before anybody gets their panties all wound up and leaves a nasty comment that I'm an idiot for not adding long tube headers at the same time as the camshaft, I am well aware that if I add long tube headers at the same time, it will help the camshaft to make more horsepower through the entire RPM curve. However, I am purposely choosing to install the camshaft by itself, as that is the only way we're going to identify with 100% certainty how much the cam is worth all by itself. By the way, Richard has tested this as well, and headers will add around 20 to 25 horsepower over stock exhaust manifolds. I can always go ahead and add long tube headers at some point in the future, and I might well do that. Now back to the Summit Cam's exhaust duration of 238 degrees at 0.050. Such a wide split of extra exhaust duration may seem a little bit excessive when compared to the sloppy Stage 2, but a quick look at the camshafts offered by Brian Tooley Racing clearly show that he's in favor of camshafts that offer wider exhaust duration. And Mr. Tooley definitely knows a thing or two about camshafts, so I'm perfectly fine with it. So with this cam, I should have a bit of a choppy idle due to the fact that it's got 226 degrees of intake duration, and it also has 6 degrees of positive overlap, which in my opinion is about the most that I would want in order to minimize the chances that I have any sort of low RPM drivability issues. By the way, in my opinion, the chop factor or the sound of the cam should never be a primary consideration when selecting your camshaft. Instead, choose a camshaft that suits the intended use that you have for your vehicle. That having been said, I must admit, when Ben comes over with his C6 Z06 and it sounds like this, I get a little jealous, and I wouldn't mind if when we're done with this cam swap, my C6 sounded a little bit more like that instead of this. Caution, keep in mind, my C6 has a manual 6-speed transmission with stock 342 rear end gears. If my C6 had an automatic transmission, it would have a torque converter with a stall speed of somewhere around 1800 RPMs. Summit says that this cam will work with a stock torque converter, but they do recommend a 2500 RPM converter as a plus. So if you have an automatic transmission in your C6, you have a couple of options to consider. You could select a little bit more conservative cam with an intake duration that's a little bit less, say somewhere around 222 degrees, and also lower that overlap down from 6 degrees. Something like the Cam Motion Stage 3 LS2 cam would probably work well with a C6 and the automatic transmission that still has the stock torque converter. Or you could go with the same cam that I selected or a similar cam, provided your intended use is similar, and give it a try for a little while with the stock torque converter in your automatic transmission. And if after driving it for a little while you determine that that low end is a little too soggy, you could swap in an aftermarket torque converter of somewhere around 3000 RPMs at that time. Now, most of you out there are probably newish to the world of aftermarket cams, but if you're someone out there that's got several cam swaps under your belt for C5s and C6s, be sure to leave a comment below. Let me know what you think of my cam choice, and if you think I'm going to have any regrets, and if so, why. If you got any value out of today's video, go ahead and tap that thumbs up below so YouTube knows to share it with the C6 and C5 community. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and I'll see you next time.